The police are closing in on a group of men suspected of producing an internet website to sell images of children being sexually abused. The internet has greatly increased the availability of paedophilia, but websites that sell paedophilia are rare. An American couple was making $1 million a week from their landslide website. They are arrested, and the US authorities hand over a list of 7,000 names of British subscribers to the police. Operation Ore is launched.
Was that the home of a dangerous criminal or a terrorist? No, that was the home of an ordinary man and his family. And he was one of thousands that were raided, not all so spectacularly or with an embedded BBC television crew, but all equally ruined. Now no one wants to admit that a great miscarriage of justice has taken place because of the appalling vista that will have to be faced. My name is Brian Rothery. I'm a retired writer and journalist, and I'm speaking to you from my home in County Wexford in Ireland, which plays a part in this story. This is not about the Birmingham Six, but the title, The Appalling Vista, has been taken from the Birmingham Six case. I'd now like to read a short paragraph here. In 1980, Lord Denning refused the appeal of the Birmingham Six, giving as one of his reasons, if they won, it would mean that the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and improperly admitted in evidence, and that the convictions were erroneous. That was such an appalling vista that every sensible person would say it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. So the men stayed in prison for another 11 years until finally they had a successful appeal. Now 30 years later, both the British police and the British judiciary and government are facing an even more appalling vista in which not just 6 men's lives were ruined, but the lives of thousands of men and their families. Now the whole story for the serious researcher is told in a free 110,000 online book titled The Appalling Vista on the website www.inquisition21.com. But I am giving a simpler and more straightforward version and shorter version of it here today. I'm going to start the story with 3 couples on a day just before September 1999. 2 of the couples I won't name, I'll give them pseudonyms, because one couple is innocent and the other couple are criminals, and hopefully someday criminal action may be brought against them. I don't want to compromise that. I will name the first couple, Thomas and Janice Reedy. Now the story starts with Derek and Eleanor King having a pleasant lunch in London around lunchtime on this day. At that same time, it was early morning in Fort Worth, Texas, and around 5 p.m. in St. Petersburg in Russia. At that point, Thomas and Janice Reedy were reversing out of their luxurious $500,000 house in the suburbs of Fort Worth in their twin sports Mercedes, probably and possibly waving to each other. Very good reasons to wave and smile, because they had started what appeared to be a gold mine in the business downtown in Fort Worth. That business was called Landslide. Derek and Eleanor in London at the same time having a pleasant lunch were looking forward to his retirement at 61 and a move to Shropshire in the west of England to a pleasant old farmhouse they bought. The waiter Sergei was serving lunch, and Leonid Lantsev was sitting in his luxurious apartment in the Fontana River block in St. Petersburg. Now this is how the Reedy business worked, the business called Landslide. Reedy had helped pioneer the adult verification scheme system, which the American government insisted on bringing in, so that all adults had to use their credit card to verify that they were adults before accessing pornography websites. As we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this was such a good intention. He had a second major initiative under his belt, however, which is that he pulled off a big deal with a leading credit card company called Superior. Superior allowed him to process other people's credit cards. He and Janice set up this landslide system to accept credit cards and to act as a broker or a gateway to many other websites. In fact, eventually they had 6,200 customers paying them to act as a broker for them. Now this is how it worked. Each customer, say in France, would go into the landslide system, see a site that perhaps he liked, and the site might be, say, in Indonesia. He would enter his credit card details, confident that landslide was associated with a major credit card company, Superior, and he wasn't going to be ripped off by some little Indonesian webmaster. Landslide would deduct 14% and send the balance around $25 out of a typical $29.99 subscription, which was for access for a day or a week or a month or whatever the deal was. So the Indonesian webmaster would get the money sent straight into his own bank account in Indonesia, while Landslide then in turn would pass back a password to the customer in France, and this password will allow that customer to access the Indonesian website. In this way, Landslide was beginning to make millions of dollars. Now we return to London. As the lunch finished, the waiter, whom ironically Eleanor thought was rather cute, Sergi, took the credit card, brought it into the office, faxed a copy of it to Leonid in St. Petersburg, came back out with the bill, handed the bill and the processed receipt to Derek. Derek tipped him. Sergi said thank you, while Leonid in St. Petersburg said thank you also, because he added another to his list of hundreds of stolen credit card identities. Now this is very important, this part of the story, so if you're interested you need to listen very carefully, because this is what has been completely ignored by the authorities ever since this landslide travesty began. Leonid was one of a number of criminal webmasters whom we have identified, and this is what they did. They set up websites with extremely toxic names, such as Little Lolitas and under 13-year-old girls and so on, names that people were not likely to complain about. And there may or may not have been anything on these websites. There could have been kittens or animals, or there could have been real illegal imagery. And then using the stolen credit card, such as the one that Leonid had just received from an innocent Derek and Eleanor in London, they went into the landslide system unknown to Reedy in Fort Worth, and they, using the stolen credit card, they accessed their own websites. This is very important. This immediately resulted in 14% going to landslide of the innocent stolen person's credit card, and the balance around $25 going into Leonid's account in St. Petersburg. In other words, they were accessing their own websites. Landslide was raided by the FBI on the 8th of September 1999, and the FBI made a video of which we have a full copy, and extracts from it are shown here. If you look carefully at one of the stills, you'll see the officials actually interfering with the files, which is a complete breach of protocol when it comes to the provenance for forensics. However, that's a detail that I will not be labouring here. The trial of the Reedys began in the following year, in the year 2000. Now in America there are two extreme instruments for the removal of the means of defence from the defendants. One is to take away all their money and to freeze their assets, which they did straight away with Thomas Reedy. And the first lawyer he asked to come and defend him, asked for $2 million. His parents had to remortgage their home to hire the lawyer he eventually got. His name was Wes Ball, W-E-S-B-A-L-L. I will be dealing with him in some detail. The second means of denying a fair trial to a defendant is to ensure that he does not have an adequate defence. And in the Reedy case, he had a highly inadequate defence, which I would also deal with. Now, I first must turn to the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. The Convention requires that all citizens of the countries supporting it are afforded due process and a fair trial, which includes an adequate defence, But the US has refused to ratify the UN Convention on Human Rights, which means that one has no means of appealing to the UN about breaches of human rights in that country. First, two facts about the trial which his lawyer, Wes Ball, failed to act on. Reedy claimed that before the FBI raid he had been dealing with an FBI agent called Frank Super, and he had told Frank Super that he suspected that some of the sites that were using him as a brokerage service were dealing in child pornography. And Frank Super had said to him, don't do anything about it, we're going to have a special inquiry come this fall, and we'll leave them there and we'll trap them. This, of course, was completely denied by Frank Super at the trial. Now I'm reading from the trial transcript. The prosecutor speaking to Super: what is your best recollection of the first inquiry or contact you might have had with the business or people at Landslide? Super replies, okay, in the summer of 1997, I'm estimating around August time period, the exact date being a bit unclear, but I know it was during the summer of 1997 because my supervisor at the time told me that he'd received some information from our Dallas office that a business located in Fort Worth by the name of Landslide, that someone had been on the internet and had seen some child pornography. Now he goes on to say that he went to Landslide office in Belknap Street in Fort Worth. He met employee Carol Clark and investigated a website called Child God. Take a note of that site, Child God, which started the Landslide case, as I'll be returning to it. Now, we got hold of a number of records here, including Carol Clark's employment record and details of the Child God website and details of the lease and so on of the Landslide offices. And it appears from Frank Super's evidence that he went to Landslide office in 1997, to an office that Landslide did not occupy until 1998. He met an employee who was not employed until 1998, and he went to investigate a website that was not using the Landslide systems in 1999. So much for Frank Super. Now I come to the astonishing Mike Marshall of Microsoft, who was part of the FBI team investigating Landslide, and he was a member of the raiding party, who can be seen actually on the FBI video of the raid. Now, if you're astonished that a Microsoft employee should have been thus involved, so was I, but you should be even more astonished by what I will now reveal about him. After the raid, he left Microsoft to head up a new technical prosecution unit that was used to convict Reedy. And before working for Microsoft, he'd been a local Fort Worth police officer. I have here a copy of a letter probably never before seen by the defence in any Landslide-related conviction. It's from Thomas Reedy's defence lawyer, Wes Ball, to prosecutor Terry Moore, written on January the 3rd, 2001, during the Landslide trial. Now, it's a very long letter, but the substance of it, or the essence of it, is that Wes Ball had just learned that Mike Marshall, this key prosecution forensics, computer forensics expert testifying against his client, had a criminal record, that he had been convicted of a misdemeanor or a crime involving the misuse of his position as a police officer with prostitutes, that there was an accusation against him that as a police officer he tried to force himself upon a woman, and that finally that he was a suspect in the murder of a prostitute. So this was the leading key technical prosecution expert in the case that started the whole Landslide travesty from Fort Worth to eventually going worldwide. The main evidence that could have cleared Thomas Reedy and stopped the coming worldwide travesty was the computer logs of activity on the Landslide system and the very large subscriber database which had the transaction details and the addresses and names of 250,000 alleged users worldwide. I say alleged because there was a huge number of fraudulent transactions like Jerry King's in there. But this evidence, these logs and this database were not even presented in court. Indeed, Thomas Reedy's only so-called forensic expert witness testified that he had examined the system by using search engines only. In other words, he hadn't even looked at the Landslide computers. Now, 8 months after the raid, in May of 2000, Reedy was sentenced to 1,335 years in prison, a ludicrous outcome. Had he been sentenced in 700 AD, he'd be coming out of Iran now. This was later reduced on appeal to 180 years, which means that had he been sentenced in the year 1830, he'd be coming out now. The original sentence of 1,335 years even had post-release conditions attached. His wife Janice was sentenced to 14 years, which she's just about completing as I speak. Now, on the day of his sentencing, US Attorney General John Ashcroft announced the sentence to the world, and this had two effects. First, it put Reedy into protective custody and isolation for a number of years, as he would have been attacked in prison, and despite that he was attacked twice, very seriously. But the second, it started the message which went out to the whole world that 250,000 names on a list from the Landside system were child pornography subscribers. And this was the real basis for the great witch hunt that ensued. Now, actually the two main messages that were transmitted worldwide were the 250,000 names, that there were 250,000 subscribers. But the second main message that was exported worldwide at that stage was that there was on the front page of Landslide that there was a click here child porn banner.
This is the computer website which has generated the world's biggest criminal investigation.
And you could see Thomas Reedy's banner that said "For child porn, click here." You know, that was crystal clear.
He had a banner, "Click here, child porn," on his homepage, and when you click that banner, that's what you got, child porn.
Now the FBI did something quite extraordinary. It took the list of 250,000 on the Landscribe subscriber database and it broke them up into 60 countries. It dealt directly with some countries such as Canada and the United Kingdom, and it sent the rest out to the police forces of the other countries through Interpol. Now, many countries did not act on it, and interestingly, the ones that did act on it were all the English-speaking countries, other than the United States, of Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia, probably because they, like the US, are deeply involved in moral panics about child abuse. Now, the country that responded with the greatest alacrity and the greatest enthusiasm was the United Kingdom, but just before I come to that, I need to deal briefly with what the Americans did with their own list, which was most interesting, because there were 35,000 on the American list. Now, if the FBI truly thought that these 250,000 worldwide were indeed child pornography seekers, you would think they would have gone after most of the 35,000, but they didn't go after any of them. What they did was they set up a special sting called Avalanche, and they wrote out to all 35,000, inviting them to visit a sting site that they set up themselves. And they netted a little over 100 only out of the 35,000. So much for what the FBI truly thought about the validity of this list being truly a list of criminal men. Now, as I say, the country that responded with the breaking in of doors and windows, as we saw in the opening clip, was the United Kingdom, where 7,200 names were received with great enthusiasm by the British police. And the notorious Operation Orr began in the early weeks of the year 2002.
The landslide was just like a gatekeeper between a Russian and two Indonesian webmasters who supplied customers with pictures of child abuse in exchange for $29.95. This is the site they had to log on to, and you can see here emblazoned right down the middle, it says child porn. Click here, exit, enter. And here you've got two options. Click here for child porn, click here for pre-teen porn. And underneath it, it says Lolita fucking hardcore. Just pre-teen hardcore, nothing else, no bullshit.
country, and the will is really there, that they will gradually work through that list and deal with all those individuals who they can be confident they have addresses for.
So anybody who was fishing around in the
Yes.
landslide site
Will get a knock on the door.
They are going to get a knock on the door.
There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind, and that's a strong message I would want to send out here. There is no hiding place here. If you engaged in that particular website, then you will be getting a knock on the door from a law enforcement agency.
When somebody uses the expression absolutely in that sense, you can be reasonably sure that there's big doubt about it, because in actual fact what happened is that halfway through these raids, proposed raids against 7,200 men and their families, the whole thing stopped and no explanation was given. But I'm fairly certain that the reason was because of what actions we had actually taken to bring it to an end. Now, there were two disgraceful elements about the Operation Or. The first was the withheld evidence, and the second was the propaganda and threats.
What we're actually talking about here is child abuse. And for those of you that haven't ever seen this child abuse, we are talking about the rape of babies. If you knock on a door and you get no reply, do not walk away. You have a warrant that gives you a right to enter by force. Please do that, because the vast majority of our suspects are expecting us to knock on their door at some point. They have all seen the paper, they have all seen the media. And they will wait inside their house in the hope that you disappear. You've got a power to use force. Please enter. Please search and seize.
Police!
Police, officer.
Police! Police!
Police, officer, don't worry.
Put the light on, please.
Nationally, we have a suicide rate of between 5 and 7%. 4 people arrested for offences involving child abuse or indecent images. We've had as many people kill themselves as we have identified those that abuse children. When you go through the door and show people that you're executing a warrant under the Protection of Children Act 1978, you have just blown the biggest hole in somebody's life that could possibly ever happen.
Whenever we analyzed the business records, we determined in April of 1999 that one website, Child Rape, had generated 1,200 sign-ups alone versus one adult sign-up in that month. So basically there was one sign-up of adult pornography versus 1,200 sign-ups of child pornography. And that was the Jakarta, Indonesian website, Child Rape, that I'm specifically referring to. The relationship was eventually expanded to 30 different websites. Child Rape brought in $17,000. Child God brought in $22,000. Child Play brought in $5,000. Triple X Lolita brought in $30,000. Russian Preteen brought in $3,000.
Now notice that she's shocked that child porn sites had so many times the transactions that the adult porn ones had. And she names Lolita's Land, Child Rape, Child God, Child Play, Triple X Lolita and Russian Preteen. Now all of these specific sites and many more were owned and occupied by 2 criminal webmasters whom we have identified, who were using stolen credit cards to access their own websites. We have their names on record, and we have their transactions and all the details, but the authorities do not want to know this and want to receive this evidence. Fittingly, she mentions Child God. Child God was the name of the site that FBI agent Frank Super claimed to have been the reason for his initial investigation.
At that point, we realized that we had really opened up Pandora's box.
This guy right here, there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 entries for this person right here. So we go over here to the far date. He did it on August 26th. He did it on August the 5th, August the 13th, So it looks like he did twice 26, twice on the 5th, and once on the 13th there, and once on the 19th. Sometimes it's every other day, sometimes it's every single day, and it just they just keep going and going and going on it. This problem crosses all social and economic lines. It crosses all professional lines.
He had the very evidence of multiple transactions being made with stolen credit cards in front of him. Indeed, some of the sites shown on the screen belonged to the criminal webmasters who were accessing the wrong websites. For example, we had the same individual paying several times on the same day for a month's access to a site and then not even visiting that site. Our own research estimates that the final total fraud was over 80% of all transactions. Now, prominent amongst the public figures producing the propaganda that ruined so many lives were, number one, Jim Gamble. Jim Gamble was the senior policeman in the UK in charge of Operation Orr, and he made many false statements about those accused under it. And he also made high-profile threats that he would get them all. John Carr. John Carr was the self-appointed spokesman for the child protection groups in the UK. He aggressively promoted the deception of the Click Here child porn gateway, through which he claimed all of those on the list had entered. For his part in this travesty, he was awarded an OBE. But now in their propaganda, the police gloated that they had the killer evidence. And this brings me to one of the most important persons in this whole story, a heroic and tragic figure called David Stanley, or Dave as we know him. Now that picture of Dave taken in happier times tells a story in itself, because he was not aware at the time of its significance, because it shows Dave playing with a monster, whereas in fact David was a true hero in that he took on the monster of the British police, the British courts and the British establishment. Dave had been raided early in the Orr operation where he lived in Bridgend in South Wales. But the site that he had been accused of accessing was so blatantly fraudulent that the police decided that it was one of the few, if not the only one, that they would not use to proceed against people. So they came and told him that he was in the clear, but not before they leaked the news of his arrest to the local media and ruined him. Now, Dave was not like the rest of the individuals who were affected by Orr, most of whom were crushed by it, and some whose loved lost their lives. Dave was a bit of a geek, a tall, gangling loner in his 30s, a computer expert. And he did not actually take it too personally. What he actually did was he started to worry about other people, and he began to visit and support other people being accused all over the country and examine their computers and contribute to their defence. Not with any great effect at the time because nobody was listening. But this very soon made him a target of the police in the UK, which begins the process of his own sorry saga. Around 2006 I had been operating a website where I was expressed, amongst other views on human relations, I expressed very sceptical views about landslide and the subsequent national raids such as Operation Orr. And as a result, Dave contacted me. And he actually came here to this house where I'm from, where I'm speaking, in County Wexford early in 2006. And he quickly recruited me into operating as the coordinator of what would be a class action or a group action against the police and the prosecution service, if we could collect the evidence and find the legal mechanism for doing this. And of course I began on this process. Suddenly in 2006, Dave listened carefully to what the police were saying about the killer evidence, and he came to me and said to me, I have the Holy Grail, I know what we need the killer evidence. And I said, what's the killer evidence? He said, we need to go to America and find the computer logs and the subscriber database from the landslide computers. Now with Thomas Reilly in prison, this was going to be difficult, of course. But however, that wasn't going to stop Dave. Now we had a friend in America called Ronald LeBlanc, a Louisiana man who had moved to Texas and had a small farm there, and Ronald was the helping Thomas Reedy and communicating with him in prison. So on our behalf, Ronald went to Thomas Reedy's father's place on an 800-mile round trip and searched the hot and dusty garage there for possible files, but found none. He then began to harass and harangue Reedy's ex-lawyer, Wes Ball, to see if Wes had the evidence that we needed. Wes denied all knowledge of such evidence. But eventually his chasing after Wes resulted in a call from him saying that he had found some tapes in the back room, but he did not know what they were. And this was most significant because he did not know what they were related to the very evidence that could have stopped the Reedy case and stopped the worldwide miscarriage of justice. He contacted Dave because he had no way of knowing himself whether the tapes were what Dave needed or not. Dave came back here to this place with a colleague from the UK, as he was afraid to fly out from the United Kingdom in case the British police, with the help of the FBI, would stop him. And if this sounds like a bit paranoid, when you hear the subsequent events you'll agree that it was not. And the colleague drove him to Dublin from here, and he flew out from Dublin Airport, met Ron, and they went directly to the offices of Wes Ball. Dave very quickly identified the tapes as what we needed, and a box of other goodies that had much in them. On the way out of the office, from Wes Ball's office, a colleague or a member of Wes Ball's staff, in a patriotic gesture, gave Dave a present of an American flag. He put the tapes in an ordinary paper shopping bag which he hung over his elbow, and he draped the American flag over the elbow, and like this he walked through the security at the airport, and within 8 hours he was back at Dublin Airport and on his way down here to this old farmhouse where I'm sitting. And one of the outhouses here, we got the cameras out, began to photograph the boxes of tapes and other material to ensure that we had a good legal provenance, and very quickly established that we had a treasure trove which included not only all of the computer logs of all of the transactions that had taken place on Landslide, but the whole database with the names of the 250,000 alleged subscribers and other items like the FBI tape of the raid and many other things such as emails and so on. Now, at this stage I had already with great difficulty found a solicitor, because most of the solicitors I first approached did not even want to talk to me. And this is a very important point, because it means that it's very difficult to get fair trial and due process in any case that goes against the dominant narrative. Because if you can't get a solicitor, how on earth can you have a fair trial or have due process? Eventually I found one. Chris Saltry is a human rights solicitor in Merseyside in Liverpool, who agreed to take on the group action. But to my shock, the first thing he asked me for, and I hasten to add that it was going to cost much more than this, was £25,000 sterling up front. This later became 40,000 that we had to raise. Now I must quickly add that later he was to do another 100,000 in pro bono work, and our forensic expert was to do £100,000 worth in pro bono work, so that the whole High Court case actually came to £250,000, of which we put up 40,000 in cash. But it was very difficult for me to raise 25 or 40,000 from a group of men who were bankrupted and ruined. In many cases had no money and had no jobs. So having received the evidence, deciding that it was in the interest of my fundraising campaign to publish it, I immediately put up the news on the website of the Inquisition 21 that we now had secured the evidence and we were going to proceed to raise the money to go ahead with a group action appeal. Within hours of this, there was a response. Within hours, Google delisted the Inquisition 21 website, making it extremely difficult for us to raise that first 25,000, and they kept us delisted for 7 months. And if it were not for many helpful links from other websites, we would not have raised the money. So after the 7 months, when I had the 25,000 and had sent it off to our solicitor, I announced again that we now had the money, we had the evidence, and we were in a position now to go ahead with the High Court appeal. within hours again, Google relisted us. Now that should demonstrate the danger of allowing Google to become a monopoly. Now that we had reached this stage, we had one last task to fulfill. We had to find a computer forensic expert who would stand up in the court and face the forensic experts supplied by the police and by the Crown Prosecution Service, and all of course paid for by the state. And that's the first problem, because most of the forensic experts work for the police and the prosecution service, from whom they get very, very, very good work. Now it's all very well to work for one defendant, but if a forensic expert starts to work for several, such as in a group action, then he may come under a lot of criticism from the police, and we'll now see what happens to ours. Now our expert was a man called Jim Bates. Now Jim had formerly worked for the police, who were quite happy with him, but he'd become disenchanted with them and their methods, and he'd also become quite disenchanted with Operation OR. And he offered his services to us, and we received them with enthusiasm. Within months after this happened, he was hit with the first of two great attacks. The police accused him of committing perjury. To our horror, they said that he had misdescribed his qualifications that they were very happy with when he worked for them. Within the following year, we worked for one more year, and we felt that this particular cloud might pass. And then to our further dismay, he was brought to court and he received a one-year suspended sentence for perjury, which virtually finished him as far as we were concerned. Now we were back where we started. We had our solicitor, we had our evidence, we had the cash, but we had no forensic expert. Then the police appeared to deliver a miracle to us. They did something what at the time seemed extremely stupid. In September 2008, they raided him for a second time. This time under an extraordinary excuse. Although his business was ruined because of his reputation was ruined, he'd started to work for a colleague. And of course I have to say that when he was convicted for perjury, the judge added that this in no way changed his qualifications. This did not mean that he wasn't a competent expert witness. So he went with this colleague to the police station to collect a computer for a defendant, and the police handed the computer over. And shortly after he brought the computer back to his house, the police raided him again with much fanfare and announcements to the media that they'd carried out a raid on Jim Bates over a computer that he had with images of child pornography on it, images that they had just given him. He was held for one day, and very late that night he was bailed when the solicitor arrived. And the bail conditions included something which was completely critical to us. They were that for the next 10 months he was not to work on any computer related work, including the Operation or Group Action Appeal. 7 months after that arrest on those bail conditions, in March 2009, we had to submit our application to appeal to the High Court, and for that 7 months our expert was not available to us. And that submission not only secured our entry to the High Court, but decided the shape of what a High Court appeal would be. After another 3 months, at the end of his bail, 10-month bail conditions, he won a judicial review in the High Court, in which the judges declared that the raid on him had been unlawful and ordered the return of his equipment. They criticised the police severely for the raid, and the judges said that the raid in no way changed the fact that he was an expert witness and his expertise still stood. That this was very important to us because at the time we believed that this restored him to us. Now the judge presiding over those proceedings was Lord Justice Stanley Burnton, a very important name, because later in our High Court action it was Lord Justice Stanley Burnton that also decided our fate. Now just before reaching the High Court, I'll return to the tragic story of David Stanley, and I'll move swiftly through this sad section. In the summer of 2009, David had been sleeping rough in the Bridgend, South Wales area Now, he'd been through hell and high water with the police. He'd complained to the police, he had complained fruitlessly to the Independent Police Complaints Committee, and he had actually walked into the magistrates' court in Bridgend and had asked for an arrest warrant against the named policeman, and had been thrown out. Now, later in that year, he was cat sitting, looking after the cats for a couple that had gone with a 7-year-old son to London for a vacation. Now, the couple was a man who had been convicted under oath and his wife. While he was cat sitting, the police raided the house and seized his laptop. Now, this was the second time they had raided Dave. The first time for child pornography images, which they afterwards said that he didn't have. Now here they were raiding him again, and in a different house. They recalled the couple back from London, and the next day they brought in social services who removed the 7-year-old son, who still has not been returned. They then took away David's laptop and studied it. Now, they could hardly find images of child pornography again, but this time, under new legislation, they found a single image of which they call violent porn. Now, we haven't been able to get that image for reasons which you'll hear about in a moment, but I believe that it was a cartoon of a man pretending to be about to chop his penis off. They then started proceedings against David, but by now David had gone on another extraordinary journey. With the help from a friend, he'd actually gone back to the United States. But back in the UK, he had been assigned a free legal aid solicitor in South Wales. Now, in the States, amongst the foolish things he tried to do, he tried to visit Thomas Reedy in prison. He claims that he was assaulted in the prison, but I believe myself that the prison staff simply ejected him. Late in 2010, he was sleeping rough on the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. And through the British consulate there, I sent him his fare and arranged for him to stay with a colleague in Wales. He flew back to Heathrow in August of 2010. And when the plane landed, it was parked to one side, and there was an announcement made for David Stanley to get off the plane first, where he was met by a number of armed police who put him in a van and brought him and put him in prison. At this stage, he was assigned a free legal aid solicitor from South Wales. I did what I could to reach him, and I actually tried to talk to a solicitor to supply evidence that could have had him freed, but the solicitor refused to talk to me on the basis that he had to have written permission from his client before he could talk about him. He spent 1 month in prison in Cardiff, and then he was brought to court, where he was given a week or something of a sentence for the so-called violent porn image, and then he went and stayed with a friend in Wales for a few more weeks. Finally, he moved to the Exeter area in the West Country, where once again he began sleeping rough in the warm days and then spending the winters in a shelter. And I return now to the High Court. On December the 6th, 2010, our case was dismissed in the High Court by the same judge who presided over the other, who was the senior judge of the 3 judges. Most of our evidence was not admitted. Some evidence that had appeared the night beforehand on an ITN program we didn't even expect. We tried a subpoena, and the CPS asked for and received a gagging order. Ironically, by this stage, the prosecution had agreed that there was never a click here child porn banner on the front page of Landslide. But this was very late. This was a small paragraph on the inside pages compared to the huge headlines that had come before. And the judge gave no account to the fact that he was aware and had presided over the case in which Jim Bates had been knocked out of action for 10 months, nor show any interest in the fact that we'd had to go to not so much to the ends of the earth, but to Texas to get the evidence, and that we'd put up to $250,000 in cash and pro bono work. None of that was taken into account. We were just thrown out. I have since prepared a petition which I have put before the European Court of Human Rights. Now, having looked at those few last clips, I come to an extraordinary letter, which is called an Osman letter, which very, very few people have ever seen. An Osman letter is a letter sent by the police warning somebody that their life is in danger. The wife involved in the cat sitting incident in which David's laptop was seized had moved, of course, and the social services, in error, sent her file to a vigilante living on the same street. Yes, I know, it's unbelievable. And she had come under attack, and the police wrote to her asking her to move home because her life was in danger. And the final sad note, on February the 1st, 2012, David Stanley went to a park in Plymouth and hanged himself from a tree. I dedicate this video to all the families who suffered and were ruined under Operation OR, and I dedicate it also to my brave young friend David Stanley.
We ruin their lives. We ruin their lives. We ruin their lives. We ruin their lives. We ruin their lives.
Open the door now! Stop back. Stop back! Please!
We ruin their lives. If we find images, they get convictions, they go on a sex offenders register. If these people have families, some of them won't by the time you leave that premises. Some of them will not have a job by the time you've completed and charged and convicted them.